Hi everyone, welcome back to Art Lessons with Rossi, and today we're going to cover how to use chalk pastels. So for our supplies, we're going to need Canson paper, which is a textured pastel paper, a white charcoal pencil, chalk pastels, and a still life. And today I'm using an apple. It's a little bit old, but I think that the color in it is still going to turn out beautiful. This pastel set by Faber-Castell has 24 colors. It's actually really an affordable little set if you're looking for one. I highly recommend it. When you use your Canson paper, today we're working on a dark gray Canson paper, pastel paper, you want to make sure that you're using the correct side. So you can also sometimes see that it has Canson written on the side of that paper as well. You want to make sure you're working on the side where you can read that right side up, which has the heavier tooth on it. The other side just has less of a tooth. So I'm going to be drawing this apple. My view of it is going to be just a little bit to the side. So I'm going to move my apple off screen where I am setting it up as my still life. And then I'm going to be drawing on the paper for you. So we're going to start with a nice line drawing in white charcoal, and that's just going to give me the proportions of the apple as well as all of its value and color changes. So anywhere where I see value change or color change, I'm going to draw that as a shape. So let's get started. So now that I've blocked out all the shapes and forms of my apple, I'm going to start by using color and using these pastels. I'm going to start with the color that has the mid-tone. So when you look at your objects, the objects are colorful, but then color itself has a mid-tone, colors that are dark versus colors that are really light. In this example, the red is actually quite dark, but it also has these lighter areas like the yellow in the apple. There's some bright green in there too. So to start off, I want to start with the mid-tone. And so I'm actually going to be using a crimson, which this pastel is a crimson, as well as a orange glaze. So I'm going to use a crimson and orange glaze, and these are going to be mixed together, and I'll show you guys how to do that in order to create the mid-tone for the apple. Now, the value of the paper you're using should also be a part of your composition. So you actually want the tooth of the paper to continue to show, and you want the color of the paper to continue to show. And so we're going to work really lightly on the surface of this paper. We are actually not going to be pushing really hard so that we keep the integrity of that paper. So I'm going to start where I see the midtones for the apple, which are in this right-hand part of the apple here, as well as towards the area that's all in yellow, maybe a little bit in the back. As I'm making marks, I want to use the pastel, and I also want to follow the contour of the apple. So I want to follow the curvature of the apple and how it kind of almost comes out, like spurting out of that stem, and then it's going to start curving and almost going vertical down, and then it's going to start curving back towards the bottom of that apple. So really thinking about the contour of that apple as I'm working. And I'm putting this color in the places where I see, again, the mid-tone of that apple, where I see that orange color, that red-orange. And I want to make sure that my lines, again, are not just vertical or horizontal. I want them to actually follow that curvature of the apple itself. Really thinking about almost like a longitude, latitude part of the apple, like where something's going from one pole, curving around the apple, ending at the other pole. And then I can even go in the other direction where I'm thinking about the curvature of the apple in the other direction. So after I establish the midtone with this orange, I'm going to bring in that crimson, which is just a little bit lighter, and I'm going to use it in order to blend the orange and make it just a little bit lighter in places. And with pastel, you don't want to smear with your finger or with a little chamois, or almost with anything else. You don't want to smear this material. Instead, you want to blend with pastels. So I'm going to blend that crimson, which is almost like a peach flesh tone color, and I'm going to make it just a little bit darker and brighter by adding that orange back on top. So as you can see, I'm not smearing, I'm only using the pastels, and I'll add yellow, etc. on top of that. So now that I've used those two, I want to create something that's a little bit darker for the other side of the apple. And so I'm going to use my sanguine, and I'm going to use a burnt umber. And I think that those are going to give me that darker color that I want. Also, if that's not bright enough, I'm going to use a alizarin crimson and see if I can brighten up that color a little bit more. So I'm going to start with the darker value first and add it where I see the apple in shadow, as well as where I see the color of the apple is a little bit darker. And I'm following the contour of that apple. I'm not just going vertical or horizontal. I'm really thinking about the way that it's curving, which direction it's curving, and changing my stroke to emphasize that. So now I'm going to go in with the sanguine. So when I'm making these marks, I'm really creating marks as if I'm hatching or cross-hatching. So I'm going in one direction, and then I can actually go back in the other, and I'm creating kind of paired lines. So let's see what happens when we add a little bit of crimson. Just make that color stand out just a little bit more, and then if we need to, we can kind of bring it back down and calm it back down by using and blending with our other pastels. And instead of the crimson, I'm actually going to grab my magenta, because I think that that has more of a punch. Like this pink is almost going to look unnatural at first. Beautiful, but a little unnatural. And I'm going to add it in, and then I'm going to calm it down, because it is just a little too bright. Actually, let's see what happens if I put a little orange on top of it. Oh yeah, that's nice. And let's see. That's nice and bright. It's giving me that much more of that feeling of the bright red I see on the apple. Okay, so now that I've done that, I'm going to grab a yellow, and I'm going to use a cadmium yellow. And I'm going to start adding in the yellows that I see in the apple. And I'm just going to blend with that yellow. So I'm going to continue to blend over any of the colors that I've made before. Again, making sure that I'm not pushing super hard so that I can continue to see the tooth of the paper underneath it. And we're going to put that yellow kind of throughout. There's lots of places where that yellow is on the apple, and it's going to have some nice consistency and continuity if I use it all over the drawing where I see those areas that are brighter in that skin tone of the apple. So now I'm going to go in and just re-add some of my darkest values just so that I don't end up losing them. I feel like sometimes we can over brighten something and it makes it look a little bit fake. So adding those shadows back in. I'm also going to create the stem. So I'm using the burnt umber for that, and I'm also going to be using a little bit of the yellow because I see a lot of yellow in that stem. As I blow over my paper, you make sure you swallow first. So as the chalk pastel kind of accumulates on the paper, you can blow it away. But you just want to make sure that you're not spitting on your drawing. So one way to assure that is you just want to swallow right before you go hoo hoo hoo. So swallow. Okay, so now I want to start working on my highlights. And so I'm going to grab my white, and really you want to make sure that you're saving the white kind of for last. Ooh, before we go to white, there's a bit of green here in the middle of the apple. So I want to make sure that that gets added. So I'm going to grab my permanent green, and I'm going to push that right behind that stem. Nice, bright, beautiful green. Pop that stem out a little bit. And I'll even throw it a little bit in that yellow because I think it'll just make my apple pop a little bit more. I don't really see that much of it in the yellow, but I think that it'll be nice for my drawing. And if I think it's too much, I can always blend it back out with some of the yellow on top. Okay, so now let's grab our white. And now I'm going to concentrate on just where I see highlights. So make sure that you're not over exaggerating the highlights because that can make the piece look like incorrect. So I see a little bit of a highlight right on the surface here. And that highlight is textured because my apple is a little wilted. Again, still a beautiful thing to draw. And I see some highlights in the top here. Again, I can even go in and kind of pop that stem out by putting a highlight right behind it. And also there's a lot of reflected light coming in on this piece. It's kind of coming and showing us the curvature of the side of the apple. So I'm gonna very much on the surface just come in and kind of swoop that in and draw where I see that light bouncing off of the paper. I also see some little like texture to the apple as well, like little dots that are yellow, so I'm going to add those in. Make some of this just a little bit brighter. And now I also want to add just a little bit more contrast, so I'm going to grab my cool gray. I'm going to emphasize that stem, add just a little bit of a dark value inside of my darkest parts of the apple. And that's just going to help pop just the edges of that contrast, which we really want in our work is to have nice, believable contrast. So now I want to create the shadow that the apple is sitting on. But sometimes it's better not to add the shadow underneath the object, but rather to use the color of the paper, which in this case is gray, in order to create kind of the negative space of the shadow itself. So I have my apple sitting on a white piece of paper, but if I just use white, it's going to really dull things out. So I'm grabbing my my cool gray number 2, and I'm just going to go around the shadow that I see and just lightly add in the texture of the paper that it's sitting on and kind of emphasize the texture of the pastel paper. And next to the apple, it can be pretty bright. And I'm going to let it go just a little darker towards the bottom, or brightening it up and making it just bright right at the edges of those shadows. So in this case, I kind of have 3 shadows that are all kind of canceling each other out. So I have a shadow to the right, and I have almost 2 shadows to the left. One that's close to the apple and really bright, and another one that's out here. So now I have established those shadows again using basically negative space and letting the shadows be a negative. Now I can go back to my other gray and add in the darkest part of that shadow that I see, which is usually right underneath the object itself. Just kind of creating that core shadow which sits inside of the cast shadow. And here's a really good moment where you can use big broad marks and vertical and horizontal lines, which will make things look flat, because we want this space to end up looking flat, looking like it's sitting underneath that apple. And so if we make marks that are big and broad and horizontal, it'll help to do that. I'm just going to tuck that shadow right underneath that apple. And then you just want to take a look at the subject, make sure that you're not missing anything. You can also think about how you can add a little bit of emphasis. So I'm going to use a little bit of a weighted line. I'm just going to give form to just kind of touch the edges, which will help just pop out certain parts without going all the way around and creating an outline that's going to flatten out my form. Instead, if I just do a little weighted line, it will help bring emphasis to the edge of certain forms. Just going to hit that stem again. I'm just going to think, is there another place to just add one more bright highlight just to emphasize the form? Just thinking about where else I see highlights. So takeaways: blend pastel with pastel. Start in the midtone and then go to your shadow and then bring in your lighter values. Think about creating cast shadows by using their negative space rather than the shadow itself, mostly if you're working on a dark paper. And make sure you sign and date your work. Thank you, guys.